Why don't we go ahead and get started? We're a little late. I was going to hopefully try to keep things on time today, but first of all, welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today on a less than pleasant day. And thank you for joining us for what we hope will be the first of many human and environmental sustainability summits that are hosted and facilitated by the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory. My name is Kevin Strange. I'm the director and the CEO of the institution. And what I'd like to do today in my talk is give you an overview of what we hope to accomplish with this summit going forward, and why we're actually doing it here on Mount Desert Island, and why MDIBL is involved. And I'll just start with our vision for the summit. Our vision is to provide a nonpartisan forum in an inspiring setting to engage all stakeholders, citizens, leaders in business, environmental science, and political communities, in significant conversations that seek to find and act on innovative solutions to our most pressing environmental problems. I read a poll the other day that said 83% of all Americans think that their federal government is completely broken, and that the partisanship has completely frozen the government and made it incapable of solving incredibly important problems. We can't tolerate that anymore. We can't tolerate those partisans divide. And it's time that we now start to act as citizens to really solve the problems that are facing us, including environmental, social problems, et cetera. So a key thing of this forum is to make sure that we are hearing all viewpoints and that we don't divide over issues. We're listening to everyone, all stakeholders, and everyone is a stakeholder when it comes to issues of human and environmental sustainability. So that is the goal. We don't want to divide over issues. We want to seek to find common ground and then build out from there. The other thing is that in the long run, as we begin to develop this summit, we don't want to simply engage in some interesting seminars once a year. What we really want to do going forward is to bring groups of people together, diverse groups of people together, stakeholders, and facilitate a significant conversation between them that will end up in the development of real actionable solutions to either local or global environmental issues. Now, one of the questions that I get asked quite frequently is, why are you doing this on Mount Desert Island, and why is the MDI Biolab involved? And there's two words: history and inspiration. The history and inspiration of the Mount Desert Island region and the Acadia region, and the history of the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory. And that history has really been associated with a strong environmental concern and a strong environmental ethic. And what I want to do to start the talk today is just give you an extremely abbreviated history. And just to tell you, I'm often accused of not paying attention to history, so I'm deliberately not doing it today. I'm going to be very superficial. But this timeline really represents the history from when we knew the first human inhabitants were here up to present day. And our first indication that there were humans on this island goes back to about 4000 BC, when we found remnants from Native American encampments. Native Americans in the area used the island for fishing and hunting. There's some dispute about when the Native Americans encountered Europeans, but everyone agrees that in 1604, Champlain sailed up and discovered the island. He noted in his journals that the spectacular mountains on the island had bare and rocky summits. And he named the island the Isle of Deserted Mountains, or Mount Desert Island, meaning bare mountains. At the same time, the British were in the area, and the British and the French got into it quite a bit. In fact, they fought with each other for 150 years for control of northeastern Canada and the northeastern U.S. But in 1759, at a battle called the Battle of Quebec, the British were very decisively victorious, ending French control of the area forever. And that's when English settlement of the Mount Desert Island began. But the English had one other problem. They had the Americans here. And they started to get into it with the Americans. There was a little conflict called the American Revolution, which began in 1775 and ended in 1783, with the Americans, of course, victorious, forcing the British out. And that's really when the Mount Desert Island region began being settled in earnest. And the settlers who came here were involved in farming, fishing, lumbering, shipbuilding, and granite quarrying. Granite quarrying was a big enterprise throughout Maine, and many of the fantastic monuments you see up and down the Northeast Corridor actually came from granite somewhere in Maine, including Mount Desert Island. But what I really want to focus on today is the 1850s going forward. And the 1850s is what I'll call the era of the Hudson River School of Artists. The Hudson River School of Artists were people who were interested in depicting American life and values in the early 1800s. And those values were exploration, discovery, and settlement. And they also wanted to depict what they thought was a very sort of quaint existence, a pastoral existence where humans coexisted in peace and harmony with nature. And those artists started hearing rumors about Mount Desert Island. They started hearing about the spectacular scenery up here and about this very unique light that artists find so enthralling and mesmerizing. And so they began coming up here in the early 1850s to basically depict that landscape and that light in their paintings. Two of the most famous painters of that era were Thomas Cole and Edwin Church, and I think you can see from some of these paintings here, again, the spectacular landscape of the Mount Desert Island, as well as this unique light, which unfortunately we don't see very well today because of the weather. But this really was the beginning of really recognition of this island as being a very, very special place. Now, the artists, of course, had patrons, wealthy patrons, back in Boston, Philadelphia, New York. They were the ones that supported the artists, bought their paintings. The artists painted the Mount Desert Island area, went back and showed their paintings. And the prominent wealthy individuals of that time began to be very intrigued by this area, the spectacular beauty, etc. And so they began to migrate up here in great droves in the 1860s and 90s. And I call this the era of the rusticators and the gay 90s. The 1890s were actually the most affluent period in American history up to that point in time. They called themselves the rusticators because they felt it was quite quaint to come up here and spend some time in what was very, very primitive conditions. That didn't last very long. They didn't like the primitive conditions too much. And so they began to put up opulent hotels. Soames Hotel was put up around 1870. Rock Inn was founded around 1908. A great building boom and a land grab began to provide facilities for the wealthy and prominent people from the Northeast cities. They also decided to build cottages. They built little quaint things called the rusticator cottages. That's one from Bar Harbor in 1883. And as you can see, they're hardly cottages. These are opulent mansions, many-room mansions built in the style that the wealthy and the prominent were accustomed to. The early 1990s I call the era of preservation and public access. A variety of prominent people on the island began to be very, very concerned about this massive building boom, about the gobbling up of the land and making it inaccessible to the general public. And one of the most prominent people of the time with regards to that concern is a guy by the name of Charles Eliot Jr. Eliot was a landscape architect with the very prominent firm in Boston, Frederick Law Olmsted, and he was very inspired by the incredible public places that Olmsted had created or had preserved. And he took that inspiration and wanted to do the same thing here on Mount Desert Island. He wanted to create public spaces that were open to everyone. And he drew up a plan, but unfortunately he contracted meningitis and died when he was 38 years old. His grief-stricken father, Charles Eliot Sr., who was the president of Harvard University, took up the cause. He looked at his son's very inspirational, idealistic plan and decided he would put it into operation. And one of the first things Eliot Sr. did was to create something called the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations. And the sole goal of this trust was to acquire lands, either through gifts or by purchase, and to make those lands accessible to everyone, public accessible lands, not locked up in private land holdings. Some of the first people he recruited to the trust were two wealthy inhabitants of the island, George Dorr and John D. Rockefeller Jr. And they set about, again, acquiring lands in the area. By about 1913, around 6,000 or so acres of land had been acquired, and George Dorr decided he wanted to turn this land into a national park. He felt that it was absolutely critical, and he had dogged determination to do that. So he went to the federal government, he went to Woodrow Wilson, and he made the argument, we've got to turn this into a national park. Wilson sort of met him halfway, and instead of creating a national park, he created the Sur de Mon National Monument in 1916. Again, to take the 6,000 acres and to make them publicly accessible. That didn't stop Dorr. He kept going after Wilson. He kept pushing Wilson, pushing Wilson. I want a national park there. And finally, in 1919, Wilson relented, and he created what was to become then known as the Lafayette National Park. And George Dorr became the first superintendent of the park, and he was often referred to as the greatest one-man show in the history of land conservation. His dogged determination to, again, take gifted land and turn it into a national park publicly accessible was something remarkable, particularly for the time. Later, in 1929, Lafayette National Park was renamed Acadia National Park, and that's the park you now know today. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was also extremely instrumental in Acadia National Park. He spent over $3.5 million acquiring lands, donated over 10,000 acres of land to Acadia National Park. He also created a very famous series of carriage roads or carriage trails, over 50 miles of those that extend throughout the park, particularly on the eastern section, and they show spectacular vistas of the park and of Mount Desert Island. And these carriage roads are restricted, no automobiles allowed. They're only allowed for pedestrians and bicycles and that sort of thing. So again, a remarkable achievement of taking gifts, private land, buying it up, and turning it into publicly accessible land. George Dorr, again, as you can see, was a remarkable person. As I said, his attempt to make Acadia National Park was viewed as the greatest one-man show of land conservation ever. He died in 1944 in poverty. He was a very wealthy guy, but he basically spent all his money buying this land up and making sure that all of us could use it in perpetuity. But in addition to preserving the lands, Dorr and others, including Rockefeller, wanted to create something else here on Mount Desert Island. They wanted more than a park and preservation of land and public accessible land. They realized that if you really were going to conserve and preserve this area in perpetuity, you needed a culture of learning and inquiry on Mount Desert Island. They were very keen on establishing that kind of culture and insight. And in 1969, what happened there, Bill? Click that, turn that back on? Yeah. Okay, so again, George Dorr, Rockefeller, they wanted to create more here than just preserve land. They wanted to create a unique culture, a culture of learning and inquiry. And in 1916, George Dorr wrote, "What a splendid and useful thing it would be if we could provide here on Mount Desert Island, in a spot so full of biologic interest and unsolved biological problems, so rich in various beauty and locked around by a cool northern sea, a home, however simple, for scientists to work on a fresh field of life." Dorr wanted to create research institutions here. And he and a number of other folks started to talk to a group, a small laboratory that was formed in 1898. It was located in South Harpswell, Maine. It was called the Harpswell Laboratory. They started to talk to those folks about moving here to Mount Desert Island. And he convinced them to do that, and in 1921 they packed everything up, came on over a boat, and established a laboratory that you're now here at, the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory. And this is a picture of the laboratory from around 1924. The laboratory's been here on the island for 92 years. During that period of time, a lot has changed. You have to constantly change the kind of science you do, the way you do science is constantly changing and transforming. And this is the laboratory of 2013, a little bit different from what it was 90 or so years ago. But the one thing that has never changed at Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory is the unique culture. This has been a place always where scientists from diverse disciplines come. They break down the barriers, those communication barriers that can often exist between diverse disciplines, and they begin to work together in true interdisciplinary teams to solve important biological, biomedical, as well as environmental science problems. MDIBL has had a very long and distinguished history in the environmental sciences, and again, I'm being very superficial here in my discussion. One of the more distinguished scientists in environmental science at the lab was William Kinter, who worked here from 1963 until 1978, when his untimely death occurred. Kinter was very interested in the role of the kidney in removing toxins from the blood, but he also did pioneering studies on the effects of DDT on eggshell finning. These were published in the very prominent journal Nature. And he also did very important pioneering studies on oil toxicity in marine birds. And this is a cover from his 1978 paper published in the very prominent journal Science, describing the effects of oil toxicity on marine organisms. Another prominent scientist of the time was David Rahl. He worked here from 1956 to 1973. Rahl was interested in the effects of pesticides on biology, on human health and toxicity. He's also interested in drug therapy, or drug metabolism and chemotherapy. Importantly, Rahl was the second director of the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. The NIEHS was founded in 1969 with the explicit goal of trying to understand the relationship between toxins in the environment and human health and disability. And Rahl was its second director, and he remained the director until he retired in 1990. He was also the founding director of the National Toxicology Program from '78 to his retirement in 1990. More recently, the MDIBL has been the site of the creation of a very important computer database called the Comparative Toxicogenomics Database, or CTD. CTD is basically amassing an enormous amount of existing information, and its goal is to look at the effects of environmental chemicals on gene activity and how the gene-environment interaction gives rise to diseases. This originated here. It continues to grow and be a very, very powerful tool used in the environmental health sciences. For over 20 years, MDIBL was the home of a marine biomedical sciences center supported by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. And this particular center was, again, focused on looking at the effects of environmental chemicals, toxins, and their effects on cells, particularly the functions of the membranes around cells. And then more recently, MDIBL has emerged as one of the leaders in a new field called environmental genomics. Environmental genomics is focused again on trying to understand how chemicals, toxins in our environment, and there's over 80,000 chemicals in our environment that we've produced, how those chemicals affect the expression and the activity of our genes, and how that leads to disease. Environmental genomics is also very interested in trying to understand how our individual genetic makeup, variation in our makeup, affects how we respond to environmental chemicals. Now, in addition to these sort of classical laboratory, benchtop sorts of scientific investigations, MDIBL has always been heavily invested in environmental outreach, environmental education, as well as preservation and management activities. This is a very unique partnership that was formed about a year ago between MDIBL, Acadia National Park, and the Schoodic Education Research Center. It's been funded by the National Science Foundation. And the goal of this partnership is to engage citizen scientists, in going out into the environment, looking at the effects of climate change, and using DNA and molecular biology techniques to try to understand how climate change is actually impacting the ecology of Frenchman Bay and the surrounding area. And then a program that you'll hear about today, this was started by one of our staff scientists, Jane Disney, the Frenchman Bay Partners. This is a remarkable achievement, I think. This Frenchman Bay partner has brought together a very diverse group of stakeholders, people who don't even often look at each other, much less talk to each other. And Jane has managed to get those people sitting down at a table, not dividing themselves over issues, but they've all agreed to a common goal, something they're all interested in, and began to build out. And the goal of the Frenchman Bay partner is to really develop a management and a sustainability plan for Frenchman Bay, a plan that will allow everyone to use the bay and make sure that it's sustainable in the long run. So as I started my talk, I said that history and inspiration were one of the key things that love the virus stuff here. All right, Bill. Hit cancel. Where is it? Cancel scan. Okay. Now what's happening?
Like your PowerPoint.
I don't see the PowerPoint, Bill. That's what I pay you for. Please come here. I have no interest in fighting with it.
You think I do?
Well, that's what you pay for. Anyway, as I said, one of the key things that the reason we're doing it here is because of history and inspiration. the incredible history of Mount Desert Island, the inspiration, the spectacular beauty of this area. And that inspiration and beauty really drove people like Elliott, Dorr, Rockefeller, et cetera, to do something quite unique, to basically acquire all of these lands and then to donate them for public use, to create Acadia National Park and a variety of other public spaces here. It's also the long history of MDIBL and environmental sciences, and also the unique, I think, history of MDIBL in being able to bring together diverse groups of scientists, break down those communication barriers between them, and get them to solve and tackle important problems. And we really want to bring those attributes here together in this summit, that history, that inspiration, and the expertise of MDIBL to really begin tackling important environmental issues. For this first summit, we are not looking at any specific environmental problem. This is really a kickoff, and frankly, it's a bit of an experiment. What we decided to focus on instead is a big overarching problem. How do you get diverse groups of people, diverse groups of stakeholders, people who have divergent interests, can't necessarily communicate with each other, how do you get them to sit down, start to get away from the issues that divide them, and instead find things that they can all agree on, and then start to build out from that to look for real solutions to the problems that we're facing. And so you're going to hear several talks today. You'll hear a talk about understanding resistance to scientific observation and scientific facts, resistance to using science as a critical tool to solving our problems. You'll hear about strategies for overcoming the resistance to science, the resistance to getting people to communicate together. And then you're going to hear some examples of what success looks like, some great success stories. So the goal in the long run, though, as I say, we want to go forward, is to not simply have seminars, but to institute these important conversations so that people come out of them with actionable and innovative plans to solve important problems. And I'll have to say, the summit here today is an experiment. We don't know if it's going to work. And in fact, a lot of what will determine if it's going to work is the response we hear from everybody today to determine if they really want to see this sort of effort continue, and they want to see the legacy of Mount Desert Island built upon so that this can really become an international center for tackling tough environmental issues, whether they're local or global ones. I just want to finish up by making a couple of very important acknowledgments. This entire summit would not have been possible without a very, very generous donation we received from Christie's Auction House in New York City. That donation was facilitated by John Hayes. John has had a long, long history with Mount Desert Island. His father, Richard Hayes, was a scientist here at the lab for many, many years. He was a director of the lab for several years and served as one of its trustees. And John is also now one of our trustees on our board. He saw the opportunity to direct some proceeds from a sale there to MDIBL. The Hayes family has had a very, very long history and interest in environmental issues. And what we chose to do with that donation, again, was not something small, something piecemeal, but to really start to tackle this bigger issue of how we can use the history, the inspiration of this area and of the laboratory to really begin to tackle big, big environmental issues, whether they're local or global. And then the other person I want to acknowledge is Tara Rockefeller. She played a very key role in helping us get this off the ground, and particularly she worked with members of our MDIBL Leadership Council to actually make this program happen. So I want to make sure these folks are acknowledged, that it wouldn't have occurred without their incredible efforts. So I'm going to stop there.